As she said, we are Chun and Rafay, and we will be your MCs for today. Now, for our first speaker, I would like to introduce Dr. Abhilash Hareendranathan. He is currently a research associate at the Department of Radiology, University of Alberta. He is a co-founder of the Collaborative on Ultrasound and Deep Learning and has been working on various research projects in medical robotics, medical image analysis, ultrasound, and artificial intelligence. He was the R&D lead at Meadow AI, which is a Singapore Edmonton-based startup company that aims to develop AI-augmented cloud-based solutions for ultrasound image analysis. Please welcome Dr. Abhilash for his talk, Role of AI in Point-of-Care Ultrasound.
Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for that introduction. And yeah, it's so wonderful to be here and see everyone. So I'll be talking about the role of AI in point of care ultrasound, or POCUS as it's called. And I'll be basically explaining some of the research that we did in our group. Our group is NIDIS, that's the Northern Institute for Development of Ultrasound. And we generally work on various applications of AI in different kinds of medical images. So we work on MRI images and CT, but predominantly ultrasound. So I'll be talking mostly about ultrasound applications. So just to get things started and where we exactly fit in this picture. So if you think about AI and medicine, the history of AI, the point where it actually took off in the field of image analysis would be perhaps around 2012 when the AlexNet famously overtook all existing technology. And then from that point on, CNN becomes the de facto kind of model that you would use for all applications. Now, that was kind of that tipping point happened for images in 2012. Now, the question is, has such a similar thing happened for medical image analysis? So that's one of the key things that we're thinking about. And I personally feel that's exactly what's happened over the last 2 years, because as bad as things had been during the pandemic, a crisis is kind of the perfect opportunity for technology. Because if you look at the surge of applications that have just come along in the last couple of years, that actually completely beats all that's happened, say, 10, 15 years prior to that. And one of the key, I wouldn't call it exactly a change, the two directions that AI in medicine generally takes is, one is autonomous AI solutions, where you basically have an AI system that replicates whatever a radiologist can do. And this was what interestingly led to this discussion or debate or conversation on whether whether it's going to be radiologists or AI, and are radiologists going to lose their jobs? Is it going to be that AI overtakes all the systems that's there in medicine? Well, that didn't happen. Not only did it not happen, it kind of reminds us of some of the debates that happened around computerization in the early 80s and 90s, wherein people were thinking about computers as, is it going to be something that completely overtakes our jobs? Are people going to just lose jobs with computers, et cetera, et cetera? So what essentially happened was, instead, people with computer skills soon became way more employable. And it's kind of happening the same way with AI as I see it, because a radiologist plus AI becomes way more potent than just an AI autonomous solution. So just to put things in perspective, where we fit in is in this realm of AI guided medical care. So it's always with a radiologist in the loop. We're trying to develop solutions that places the decisioning power still with the radiologist, but with better tools and better information, so the person takes a much well-informed decision. So on that note, let me get into the field of point of care ultrasound. So okay, good. So point of care ultrasound is generally all ultrasound applications which mainly emergency applications, where you basically have an ultrasound device that's taken to the patient, and you basically do ultrasound examinations in real time. The biggest advantage of ultrasound is, unlike, say, X-rays, you don't have the issue of radiation, and you get images pretty much at the real time. And then compared to devices like MRI, you're talking about a device that costs around 150K when you're talking about MRI versus when in an ultrasound machine, you're essentially talking about something that would cost something in the order of thousands. So pretty much these probes that you see here in the picture, this would typically cost around $4,000 altogether. And it's come to a point where ultrasound devices can literally be carried in the pocket. So it's very easily portable compared to any other kind of mechanism. So using an ultrasound device, you can have a system in which a radiologist or a clinician basically carries the device in their pockets, just connects this to a tablet and does the scanning. So compare that with something like an MRI, which is kind of housed in a hospital and it involves a lot of economy, a lot of money, and it hardly can be transported. So it's the old mechanism of the patients going to hospitals being replaced by the technology going to the patients. So that's where POCUS actually comes into play, and where we're trying to focus on our applications in which we could make a difference by replacing conventional x-rays or CT scans with ultrasound examinations, because it's less expensive, it's way more portable, it's way more feasible to have large scale screening programs, as I will show in one of the applications that this specific application here, where we are using ultrasound to diagnose a condition called hip dysplasia. I'll be describing that application in more detail along in the upcoming slides. So just to put the scope and the kind of works that we've been doing in perspective, these are some of the applications where ultrasound is commonly used, and we see a lot of potential for using AI in these applications. For example, carotid artery imaging. It's actually a very old application, I would say, because people have been trying to use carotid artery ultrasound images to identify plaques, which are kind of indicative of strokes that can happen due to plaques in the carotid artery. Cardiac ultrasound, again, a very common application of ultrasound. We are focusing on a whole bunch of musculoskeletal applications, as you can see here. So, for example, the rotator cuff ligament tear. Conventionally, all these musculoskeletal applications, like the rotator cuff ligament tear, fractures, and in elbow and wrist, all these right now go through an X-ray examination. And the crazy part is that basically results in unnecessary X-ray exposure, because most of the time no fractures are found. So the person shouldn't have been doing the X-ray in the first place, but that's done because it's currently the first line of examination, which is where we are trying to be disruptive, and we basically want to introduce ultrasound there using these technologies. And we'll see. The obvious question is why isn't it uh, being replaced yet? And that brings us to some of the key challenges in ultrasound. So the first one in incorporating AI in ultrasound is kind of the ambiguity that we get with ultrasound images. It's pretty much true about any medical imaging modality, because the way generally AI systems are trained, all of you know that it requires a very solid ground truth. And using this ground truth, you basically train a system to learn to replicate the performance of an expert. But now in medical applications, the key issue is that the labels that we receive would vary between the experts. And in most cases, even the agreement between these experts would be moderate. So what that means is it's actually a very challenging use case for something like deep learning or for conventional CNNs. The other issue that we commonly encounter in medical images is what we call a data imbalance, which the quintessential example there would be that of tumor classification applications. For example, if you have these giant data sets of, say, thousands of images, you would have hardly 10% of them having the positive case wherein there is a tumor, versus a whole ton of images where there is absolutely uh, um, no positive case. So what happens in such scenarios is that it becomes difficult to train a network to classify just based on the image, based on the severe data imbalance. Another main challenge that we find in ultrasound specifically is that the images themselves kind of lack the quality that you're used to seeing in, say, MRI or CT. So as you will see that an ultrasound image is basically an echo signal that goes into the tissue and reflects back. So inherently, it's way more noisier than what you would expect in something like MRI, which is a way more sophisticated modality. And the final challenge we are trying to address is the generalization. Um, so ultrasound presents a very interesting use case because you have a lot of ultrasound scanners available in all hospitals, and each of these is a little different from each other. Now, the way AI is trained is that you would basically be gathering your information from the center where you have access to all that information. And now, when you try to test this on data that comes from a new center, there's so much of diversity in the kind of the data that comes from one scanner to other. And the challenge is, how do I train a model in such a way that it gives the same performance on the data that I get from my center versus another center which uses a different kind of scanner, for example? Would it work if it's a lower resolution ultrasound scanner? So these are some of the challenges that we are trying to address in our work in general. Now, today I'll be focusing specifically on this use case of hip ultrasound, where we would be talking about a technology that we developed to automatically identify hips that have a condition called dysplasia, which is a dislocation of the hip joint at birth. So let's talking about hip dysplasia in itself. It happens roughly in 1 to 3% of infants, and this number is actually much higher based on the ethnicity. For example, in indigenous populations, this is as high as 15%. Surprisingly, it's mainly due to the swaddling practices and things. But the good thing about this use case is this is one scenario where an early diagnosis makes a big difference, because if it can be diagnosed early, the treatment for this condition is super simple. All you need to do is put the child in the soft cast, and the bone kind of remodels itself. So, so the basic issue is that the bone has been dislocated from its socket. So it's like a ball and socket joint, and you have a ball part and a socket part, and the socket is kind of malformed in this case. So it does not rightly hold the bone in position. So in such a case, what we do is we basically have to scan the infant using ultrasound screening. And this is a very simple procedure. And if it's done properly, you can diagnose it. And you essentially send the child for what's called this treatment of Pavlik harness, which is a soft cast, which the baby is put in for a few weeks, and it's all solved. Now, if it's that simple, why isn't it done for every baby is the question. We must just be doing it just as we count the number of fingers and toes of babies. Now, the reason it's not done is, A, ultrasound images are hard to acquire. So despite all these advantages, you always need an expert to acquire the right kind of image. And B, it also has a manual interpretation, which kind of leads to a large number of false positives. Because depending on how the specific sonographer is used to interpreting these images, you might come up with different kinds of results. So this presents a good use case where we would benefit by actually using ultra this is exactly how this image would look like. For example, this is what I was talking about in terms of the ultrasound image. It's a pretty noisy image in which you're looking for these landmarks. And if you're unused to ultrasound imaging, this image would pretty much not convey any information. So that's that's where we basically require an automatic system to provide more information and to improve the quality of this image. So these would be the two themes that our research focuses on. So this was in 2014 where we started using ultrasound image analysis using 3D, because we found that compared to the 2D ultrasound that's commonly used, by using 3D ultrasound, we have way more information. But now the problem with 3D is that, unlike the 2D ultrasound, this cannot be easily interpreted by a human being, because a human expert would have to go through each of these slices, pick the right slice, and try to come up with these measurements. So instead, what we did was we developed this technique wherein, with a few key points, as you can see that the user places, we develop a segmentation, and we basically get the entire model of the hip bone here. Now, what's great about getting the 3D model is that compared to the 2D picture, you have way more information in this 3D picture. So what you see on your right is two different hips, and the normal examination that takes place is this. So this examination with one single 2D picture, and you can see that they don't look that different in that particular view. But compared to what we do here, when we get the entire three-dimensional shape using this technique, you can see that one is obviously looking different from the other, and actually the second one is the abnormal case where the hip is dysplastic. So this difference becomes way more apparent. So it's much more information that we can gather using these kinds of automatic techniques. So what we did from there was the initial technique was good, but you still need the user to be clicking on these and clicking on the image and providing these key points. So with AI and with all the techniques we have, we basically started developing CNN models, which could be used to uh, provide these segmentations automatically. That's an interesting approach which we took. If you're familiar with CNNs, it's kind of different from a common CNN because instead of using going image by image, we're basically trying to split an image into superpixels, and each superpixel is classified. So we basically have a much more efficient kind of classification here, and you can see that we get a pretty good result in terms of root mean square error or Hausdorff distance or die-score, which basically measures overlap. So using these techniques, we were able to segment the bone. Now, this is where it gets interesting. So we now have a technique using which we can have a 3D ultrasound image. We can basically use a CNN to completely classify this image. We can use a CNN to perform segmentation, or you can get the interesting areas in the image. Now, the challenge is this is all assuming that that image is good and it contains these landmarks. Now, what if that assumption is not valid? Well, what if the sonographer just screws up? So if the sonographer basically takes an image that doesn't have these, now all the AI techniques that we've developed till this point um, doesn't perform the way we want it to perform. So what we did was we developed further techniques to assess the quality of a given ultrasound image. So in an image, we basically would check and see if it contains all these landmarks. So these landmarks that you would have seen here, we basically see if it is clear enough. Does it contain the bone? Does it contain the femoral head? Does it contain things called this bony structure called the ossetium? Now, using this technique, we were able to screen these bad images up front. So that was one interesting result that we recently got. So we basically had CNN models for each of these landmarks, and you can see the accuracies and sensitivities of these techniques. So the idea here is to have a kind of screening mechanism in which all these images that are not good enough to go into the model in the first place get screened up front. Now, this is where it's almost gets like this Russian doll, wherein you release one level and you get to the next one. So we now have the segmentation technique. We found that you could have a scan quality assessment technique. But now, for example, if you're moving from the ultrasound machines to handheld scanners like the one you see here, there's a drastic difference in image quality. So what you get from this ultrasound machine versus this handheld device, which is getting more popular, is very different. So the question is, can the AI models that were trained on these conventional scanners still be used for pocket-sized ultrasound scanners? Now, and the other question is, can the images from these pocket-sized scanners be enhanced so that you replicate the same quality that you would get in a conventional ultrasound scan? And this is where we basically use this technique of domain adaptation, which is fairly common in natural images. It's a very interesting idea wherein you can essentially translate between two domains of images. And in my case, one domain would be the conventional ultrasound scanner, and the other domain would be the new handheld ultrasound scanner. So I'm trying to do this transformation from one set of images to others. So you can see a couple of examples here where if you have a pair of images for each image, if there is a corresponding pair, then this transformation becomes very easy because you basically know what you're transforming to, versus unpaired image translation where you have basically just two sets of images. And from one set of images, you want to see a correspondence to the next set of images. So in this case, mostly in medical images, you come across unpaired image translation. And for unpaired image translation, one approach is the GAN. But the GAN essentially has the two components, which is a generator and a discriminator. The idea is that you basically feed in images into both these, and both the generator and discriminator get trained together. So the purpose of the generator is to create this fake image that takes in an image from this handheld device, which is very low cost, and transform it to something that mimics the image that comes from a high-end device. And the purpose of the discriminator is to see if it can distinguish between the fake image and the real image. Now, this idea is used in natural images, but generally, what in medical images, the challenge is there's a particular scenario that's called a model collapse that could happen, wherein the generator just keeps giving the same image no matter what. So it looks like a high quality image, but it does not correspond to my input image. Now, what exactly do you do to solve that scenario? Generally, in medical images, people have used something called the cycle GANs, which basically introduces a reverse mapping. So you have one image which you transform to your target domain, and then you have a reverse mapping that transforms from your target domain back to your source domain. So that way, you basically try to ensure that you are preserving all the structural information present in your initial image, right? So this this technique of cycle consistency is what's used in the cycle GAN. Now we were making some fundamental changes here, and we were using this technique called contrastive unpaired translation, where we are trying to use the idea of contrastive learning here. So if we want to transfer images, essentially the idea here is that between this image, this noisy image that comes from a handheld device, and a good image that comes from the conventional device, we just need to ensure that corresponding things look similar on both. So you basically have to ensure that the bony structure on one side looks like the bony structure on the other, and there's high dissimilarity between structures that come from different areas in this image. So this is what we did, and we use this formulation wherein we basically use patches. So specific patches in the image were used for this operation. And there's a faster variant of this technique called the fast CUT, or the fast contrastive unpaired translation. And we got pretty interesting results in the sense that we were able to improve the contrast, we were able to improve, reduce the noise level in these images, and also maintain the structural similarity. So the SSIM and cosine similarity were what we used to measure how similar it was to the original image. So this is some of the images that we got after the translation. So the first image is the original image. We can see the second image is where it gets enhanced, and the third image is enhancement using fast CUT, which is the new technique, wherein we can essentially improve the quality of the image without compromising much on the noise levels. And in terms of the future work, some of the works that we are planning to do in this space is to introduce the idea of graph models to see if we are able to learn these shapes. Now that we have learned how to segment the shapes of the bone, we are basically trying to take it to the next level to understand what would be the normal and abnormal growth trajectory of hips, and what exactly causes this condition. So we are basically going in an exploratory direction from this point. And in terms of the next stages, this is exactly what we do with all these applications that I was talking about. So you have the prototype stage where you get your initial results, and then there's this refinement, and the next stage is the outreach, and we basically go to the community. So right now we're doing the clinical studies among indigenous populations, precisely because, as I told you, the incidence of this condition is much higher in indigenous populations. So we're reaching out to these communities and trying to do the scanning in clinics. And we are also trying to um, do similar studies in the developing world. So we have identified two locations in India where we would be doing this study. And this is done in collaboration with I'm a Hippie, which is a Vancouver-based organization that does a lot of work on hip health and provides a lot of funding. So thanks to I'm a Hippie. And finally, it's all thanks to a wonderful team that I work with. So again, we are from this team, Nidus, and Cuddle is a collaborative that we found for ultrasound and deep learning. And yeah, best friends with Amy, and these are some of the collaborating sites that we work with. So Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, Care Arthritis is one of our Meadow AI. I think you're more familiar with, and Care Arthritis is one of the startup companies that focuses on MR imaging. So we are also trying to move towards use cases in MRI. On that note, I think I'll conclude, and questions.
So thank you, Dr. Abhilash, for that talk. I really liked your research presentation, and I thought it presents amazing potential for increased accessibility of ultrasound. So now we will have 5 minutes for questions. For in-person attendees, I will ask that you step up to the podium, the microphone in the center to ask your question. And for online attendees, you can put your questions in the chat and one of our execs will relay them to Dr. Abhilash.
That's okay. I can speak loudly enough while Islam figures that out. So thank you very much for the presentation, Dr. Abhilash. I had a question about body composition. So does body composition affect ultrasound results? And if so, how much is the AI hindered by that variability?
Well, that's a great question, actually. I mean, the quick answer is yes. Body composition does affect the ultrasound image, unlike some of the other modalities. For example, it's very sensitive to various tissues that the ultrasound image kind of traverses through. So, for example, if you're looking at abdominal images, for example, imaging the kidneys, which was one of the first projects I started working on as a researcher, it makes a huge difference of the body size of the person in terms of it's pretty easy to image someone who hasn't many layers of fatty tissue intervening. So it does make a difference. Now, does AI get hindered by it? It depends on the data set that you're training it on. I mean, one of the best things about working inside a center like the University of Alberta Hospital that's high volume is that you do get all these body types in your data set. I mean, although you specifically don't have to search for it, if you were to just get an unbiased data set with a large enough data set, it you do have sufficient information to train the AI on for that kind of variance. And yeah, and especially it does not make much of a difference in this particular application, but yes, in abdominal applications, yes, it does make a difference, and fortunately we do have access to that kind of data. So that's
It might just be better if I stay over here for the rest of that. So we have a question that was submitted online. Um, and it reads, Dr. Abhilash, can you give other examples of applications of your ultrasound research other than detecting hip dysplasia?
Oh yes, for sure. So some of the other applications we are working on, one would be right there in the next talk, which is on wrist and elbow scans, which is what we are very excited about right now, wherein you're looking to image pediatric wrists and elbows, because essentially these kids are taken to the pediatric emergency and they directly go through an X-ray. And so, is it a good thing to get an X-ray so early in your life just for a fracture that you might not be having? So that's where we're basically trying to bring in ultrasound and do exactly the same thing. So try to identify if there is a fracture or not. If so, we directly start the treatment for the child. So that is one application. The other application that we are actively working on is on cardiac ultrasound, which is actually something that's pretty common. Ultrasound images of the heart are being taken for a very long time now. Where we plan to add value is by simplifying the entire process and bringing AI in, and again trying to make it less dependent on the person who's actually performing the scan. So by providing a guidance, for example, you place the probe. Everyone knows to take a rough ultrasound scan, but not many people know to take the perfect ultrasound scan. So where the AI comes in is for a navigation guidance perspective to see if we have a right kind of image. So cardiac and wrist are two that we are particularly interested in. Other would be like ultrasound of the lungs, which we did for COVID-19, because it leaves traces in the lungs. So that's another project we're working on. So these would be some of the applications.
I have a kind of follow up to that. With all this, if you're able to help guide the ultrasound and tell the user whether it's a good image or not, could this allow like any untrained person to take ultrasounds?
Oh yes, yes, absolutely. I mean, that's exactly the direction we're planning to take. And we actually did this interesting study with these hip images as well, wherein we brought people who have a knowledge of human anatomy but haven't taken an ultrasound scan in their lives. So we just brought them in and tried to see what we could do in such scenarios to see what's the difference between them versus the sonographer who has, say, 20 years of experience doing this all her life. So we just compare the two, and this is exactly what we were trying to do to give that real-time feedback. So the first scenario is with no feedback, just the verbal instruction, the way a person is trained. You send the person with an ultrasound probe and they take an image. The other was with along with this training and video information, we try to give information on what's gone wrong essentially in a scan. So that's the key thing. So to say that it's a poor quality scan because of these reasons, and that enables the person to get the right scan eventually. And what we're planning to do is exactly what you had also mentioned, wherein we could try and use a navigation system wherein you could actually give markers on the ultrasound image saying move left or move right, or point it at a different angle. So that is exactly what we plan to do, and it's an exciting area.
Another question we have is, do you think this is profitable enough for privatized healthcare providers to feel compelled to push this forward?
Well, I think yes, it definitely is because if you think about the expense that's involved in this, it's come down a big deal when we move from these conventional ultrasound scanners to these handheld scanners. So the handheld scanners that I had in the picture here, so these ones here, this literally costs just $5,000 per unit. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to provide these to each of the centers that we are working with. And thanks to generous funding from the TD Bank, that's one of the initiatives we are trying to do to reach out to these centers. And these units are multi-purpose. So you basically have the scanner, it can perform a variety of scans. So if you were to compare it with what it takes to do something like an MRI or a CT examination, this is relatively very low cost. Plus, if you were to look at the benefit of these applications, say for example, in the hip ultrasound case, one one thing to bear in mind is the expense that it entails with the misdiagnosis. Because if this is missed, this essentially leads to surgeries in later life. And then when you add in the diminished quality of life of the individual and the prospect, it's especially with the hip ultrasound case, it's really a tragic scenario where we see people having this issue, like people in the mid to 30s when you should be at your productive best. These people would have a diminished quality of life because you have issues with the hip and you're not able to perform your things, you're not able to actively be involved in the work, and it's all because of the simple scan that's being missed in early life. So if you were to weigh the two, I think it is a compelling thing for any healthcare system to provide.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abhilash. That does bring us to the end of the Q&A period. Thank you very much for that presentation.
Thank you.